My name is Steve, and we are here today for another Friday conversation with some friends. So I'll let them introduce themselves. Epic, you want to kick us off? Tell us about you and your channel.
The name's EpicTalez. You should check out my channel. It's a fun channel to watch, and yeah, I've been so excited to get on this live stream and talk today with the Critical Dragon. And yes, I have so much questions to ask, and I've been watching some of his videos, and I have so many questions, and I want to like pick his brain and see how narrative specifically works.
Mhm. And AP, you want to tell us about you and your experience in your channel?
Hi, I'm AP. My channel is a Critical Dragon, where if you watch any of my videos, I start them all with saying, and I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books, because I'm a recovering academic. For my sins, I used to be an academic, and then found a powerful need to actually eat, and therefore had to get a job that would pay me. So I used to study narrative. I used to teach narrative. I used to study and teach literature, and worked. I work as a freelance developmental editor for science fiction and fantasy. But my channel is focused on talking about books, talking about stories, talking about how they're constructed, and I hope they're entertaining and occasionally educational. But your mileage may vary.
And Taylor, you want to tell us about you and your channel?
Yeah, so I'm Taylor from the BookTube channel, Maed Between the Pages. I always have it below in the name. Uh, yeah, basically my channel, I talk about books. I like books. It's early. I need coffee. Sorry, but that's the gist of it. You can find me there if you want to connect with me. That's probably the best place.
Awesome. So AP, I'm so glad, so great. We're so grateful to have you to pick your brain and to ask a bunch of stories or a bunch of questions. So I'd like to kick us off with someone like me who isn't. I don't know the ins and outs of the nuts and bolts, but if you can describe what narrative is to someone like me who doesn't know a whole lot about it, how would you describe it to me?
Well, typically, see, when we talk informally, we talk about, oh, that was a really good story, or I really loved the plot. And the thing is, within narrative, the study of how these things are sort of formed, a narrative is made up of narrative events. So they're the things that happen, characters, the people who are going through the things that happen, a setting, and those sorts of elements. Then there's tone and atmosphere and all of that. But story would be the narrative events organized chronologically from beginning to end, which, as you well know from lots of the books and films and TV shows that we enjoy, not every narrative is arranged that way. And plot are the narrative events as we encounter them in the narrative. So, what I mean by narrative is basically what most of us mean when we talk about a story, the thing that we are consuming, the tale. And it's just a word that we use because story has a specific meaning and plot has a specific meaning, and it helps us keep those different ways of thinking about it sort of separate in our heads. So that's all that narrative is. And then narratology, which sounds very fancy, but is just a way of saying studying narrative.
It does sound very fancy.
Hmm.
And why do we love telling stories? What is it about storytelling that grips us the way it does?
Well, everyone, we experience life in a lot of respects as a story where we are the central character of our story and we interact with everyone else's story. When we think of history, we don't think of history really as a sequence of dates. We think of what happened, the people that it happened to. We narrativize so much in our lives. When someone says, "Oh, what happened last night?" Oh, let me tell you what happened. So then, and they launch into a story about what happened. Narrative, in a lot of ways, is one of the things that joins us all together as a species. Hello.
And our friend Mr. P.L. Stewart, author P.L. Stewart, author of A Drone Kingdom, is here to join us. Thanks for coming to hang out with us, P.L.
I'm honored to. Can everyone hear me okay?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Honored to be here. Hey, Epic Taylor, and nice to meet you, AP.
Oh, pleasure to meet you too.
So, like, something I wanted to ask you, I can't imagine how many books you've read, and just like what really goes into like understanding the structure of narrative, or what works, what doesn't work, and everything. Have you, by any chance, read A Hero with a Face?
Uh, Campbell's book. So the Hero
Yes.
with a Thousand Faces. So he was essentially a folklorist, and looked at a whole lot of folk tales and myths and those stories, and went, if you take away everything that makes them unique, if you start looking at the structure of them, you come up with the hero's journey. A structuralist approach to the sort of the main story beats would be a way of kind of expressing it. And structuralism is obviously one of the big modes, or a big mode of literary analysis, of trying to distill down movements within a narrative. And we talk about narrative structures, and you can talk about Freytag's pyramid. And most people are familiar with Freytag's pyramid. You start with the introduction, the setting of a scene, and setting up who your characters are, and then you have an instigating event, and then that leads to a rising action that builds to a climax, and then after the climax you have the sort of the conclusion, the epic finishing of the battle, and that leads to the falling action and the sort of the repercussions of that, and then the denouement, and you reestablish how the world is after it all started. And that pyramid shape is one of the narrative structures that we commonly recognize, particularly in a lot of Western storytelling. But it was a 19th century German Bildungsroman pattern.
Hmm.
So
That's so interesting. Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Did you want- Oh, that's so interesting that you mentioned that, because that's one thing that's really stuck out to me as a reader. Something I've discovered is when I branch outside of Western stories, there's a completely different narrative structure. So I've been reading a lot more translated Japanese fiction recently, and those stories took me a long time to really get a grasp on, because there wasn't a rising or falling action per se. Those books don't necessarily follow that narrative structure. I don't know what the name is. I'm sure there's a name for it, but
there is,
but, yeah.
and I've forgotten the name, and I'm
I'm
very
sorry
embarrassed.
to put you on the spot there. Well, we can just say that structure is something that I find really interesting to engage with, because I grew up with that pyramid structure. So it took an adjustment for me as a reader to engage with a story like that. Even though I wanted to, I found myself feeling either bored at first, or what's the point of this story? Like, I don't see an obvious moral or an obvious conflict. But then I learned a lot of, in my opinion, a lot of the points of those stories are to be there in the moment. It's about the moment, not the future, which is something that I really have had like a discovery the past year with that.
But one of the big things about these story structures, because there are lots of different structures, is that they aren't prescriptive, they are descriptive. It's describing trends in and structures in narrative that we find. Because if you think of the number of even like a police procedural show, it doesn't start with an introduction. It starts with the instigating event. Oh, look, the guy's dead, and the homicide detectives rock up. That's the instigating event before the introduction. And then if you have an A plot, a B plot, and a C plot, which is very common in a lot of writing, you play around with the structures within that when they're interlinking. So if you think of the basic building blocks of writing being words build into sentences build into paragraphs build into scenes build into chapters. So you go, there's a pattern, everything follows that. But these structures can have that same micro and macro expression, because you can have a chapter following a scene setting initial couple of paragraphs, where, like, how many books have you read where when you read a chapter, it opens with telling you what the physical scene is, what the landscape is, and then you find out in the next paragraph who the characters are. and then something happens that gives the character something to do, and then that builds to the climax of it. So you can imagine, particularly in fantasy, a scene where people are in a wood. So you get the woods described, and they're riding on this road, and then they suddenly realize they're being followed, and then there's a chase sequence, and then they crest the hill and they see the city in front of them, and they ride to safety. End of chapter. And you go, that follows basically Freytag's pyramid. But it's just a way of describing what happens. It's not saying that every narrative has to follow this, because there are loads of stories and loads of chapters which have completely different structures, because you could end a scene on a cliffhanger, which is basically ending it mid-scene, because the next scene is going to resolve that cliffhanger. So that's not following the Freytag model, if you will. So it's understanding all of these different things. Even if you think of like a classic one, let's think of tragedy and comedy. Tragedy is a different way of thinking about it, because the character usually starts off, their life is up here and it's great. And usually it goes up a bit and everything's going well, and then it all goes horribly wrong. And it's kind of a sad face. It's the sad bit of the smiley face. But a comedy, classic comedy, on the other hand, usually starts out with the character's about here, and things are going on, and then they start going badly and badly, and then suddenly everything goes really well and everything resolves in the end. And it's a happy face. It's a smiley face. And that, again, is another narrative structure. The 3-act play, the 5-act play, all of these are different structures that are routinely deployed in narrative. And PL could probably talk about this a lot more as an author, about employing different structures and techniques.
Well, and obviously, thank you, AP. And Epic, another author in the room. I'd love to hear what he has to say. One thing, and this is so insightful, AP. I could listen to you all day long here. I'm even scared to open my mouth. But the one thing I've learned as a writer is that, and Taylor's point is that I've basically taken all the things I learned in school, in university, with my background, medieval literature, and I've tossed a lot of those things out, to be honest with you. Because, for example, I was having a really interesting discussion with some fellow BLPC writers in a chat group, and we were just talking about how one element of a particular writing literary style, show don't tell, that it doesn't work a lot. It doesn't work as much sometimes for specifically BIOPC writers. And why is that? Because for one thing, we just want to get our stories out there. And part of that's how we think. We just want to get the story out there because we're always feeling challenged that we're not going to have a voice to say certain things. So we end up sometimes simply telling, because we want to get this, we feel our story needs to be told, right? And it's not to say that we aren't conscious of the need to write a book where everything there isn't just tons and tons of exposition, and a lot of it is now that's cultural, right? So it's just funny how when especially when I hear a P talk, and he's an incredibly smart man, that you think about. I learned, especially as an indie author and a person of color, that from my story, some of the literary conventions, the writing conventions, I felt I had to toss out and just write my story the way I thought it would best come out. And obviously, you're not going to be aware of how successful you are until after the story is published and you start getting feedback and reception. I mean, I'm talking about after beta readers after editors. It's really when readers get that finished product. But yeah, I've realized that a lot of the things that I've learned there, I've gotten some great advice over the years from various people who are a lot smarter than me about how to write a book and what writing a good book means. But I've also learned that, some of the things that we've been taught as writers, especially if you've been formally trained as a writer, you've gone to writing classes. I have friends that, one of my friends has got an MA in creative writing, and she says the same thing to me all the time. Like, there's no right way to write a book, right? your readers will tell you whether or not you wrote a good book or not, right? So
Absolutely.
And like there's something to what you said there that I really connect with about like intentionally tossing out some of the rules of writing that are like official, you know. And it's the value of, for me, understanding those rules first, is that if I'm going to toss them out, I want it to be intentional, because I'm trying to create a very specific effect. And I spoke with, in the interview I had recently with Mike Shell, I spoke to him about it, and he was talking about some of the editorial like things that they wanted him to change, like in his story structure, and he was like, he just couldn't do it. Like, and he like really sat down on his idea of being a self-published author, because changing some things that he had intentionally done would have just changed the core or the essence of the story itself.
And I think those are absolutely brilliant and points that every author should pay attention to. When people talk about the rules of writing, someone please show me the legal tablet where this is inscribed in stone that people must do something. Because every author I have ever worked with, every author I have ever spoken to, whether they are self-taught, whether they have been formally taught, however they got to the point of being an author, knowing what the rule is and the effect it causes is the thing to know. It's not that you must obey the rule, but if you break the rule, you have to know what that effect causes. And I think the only binding or even general rule that I think ever applies to creative writing is what you do should best serve your narrative. And every narrative, despite comparisons to anything else, will always be unique to you. So you're finding your voice, your way to express it, and your way to communicate that to your reader. And none of the rules in the world will help you do that if you just rigidly enforce them. You have to understand them. You have to understand why people thought that was a rule, because you can create a wonderful, even if we took a very basic scenario of character A, male character A, female character B are a royal heirs to the throne. They go off on an adventure and they go through a cave system, they climb a mountain, defeat a dragon, and come back. And the first author, in telling this story, in expressing this narrative, might go, right, well, I'm going to choose first person, and I'm going to choose the male character as my first person perspective. And that will shape how they go through the narrative. The next author who gets this goes, well, I'm going to do first person as well, but instead of first person past tense, I'm going to put it in first person present tense, and I'm going to use the female character as the point of view character. And suddenly you have two completely different narratives, even though the narrative events are the same and the characters are the same. Because character A, if it's focalized in a first person from their perspective, it's going to be their view of the world. Character B, it's going to be focalized through their perspective. And then the third author comes along and they choose third person limited, and they're going to alternate chapters according to POV. The fourth author comes along and they're going to do third person omniscient. And each time, that simple narrative of the two characters going on the same adventure, you will notice, if you read all of them, that they're all very, very similar. They're telling the same story. But how they are expressed is going to be individual to that author and the choices they made simply with narrative perspective. And that is the power of understanding what it is that you do when you write, knowing what those choices can mean, the ramifications that they have, and how that shapes the thing that you're putting on the page that you hope a reader is going to look at and fall in love and immerse themselves in your story.
This might be a little bit of a branch off, totally different topic. It's not totally different, but just talking about the same story told from different perspectives or different narratives reminds me of the mythological stories that a lot of us are aware of. You know, a lot of cultures have the same origin stories. I believe most cultures, not all, but most cultures have a flood story, but it's told in completely different ways depending on the perspective of the people who created that story. So even though right now we're talking about the narrative structure of current books, that's what immediately came to my mind, which actually connects to Steve's first question, which is why do we tell stories? Why do we love them, right? It's the way of us interacting with the world. It's how we understand things. So I think it all kind of comes full circle, you know, when you look at it at a large scale, when it comes to mythological or origin stories, it rings true even on that scale, what you just said.
There was
oh, sorry, Epic.
no, go ahead. I was just going to like refer to the comment section, but go ahead.
Well, I was about to say, it's as Taylor points out, like we've been telling stories from the beginning of time. It was two cavemen sitting there going, "Did you hear what Ugg did last night?" And that's what we have been doing the entire time that we've been on the planet. We've been making up stories about other people, and then we try to understand the world around us, and we create narrative as a way to conceptualize it. You know, if you didn't understand how meteorological systems work, how weather works, it's, oh, there's a magical being in the sky that can throw lightning bolts, and suddenly it gives you a way of understanding it. Narrative quite often is a way of simplifying or exploring complex ideas and concepts. And one of the things, obviously, that science fiction and fantasy do is it allows us to remove them slightly from the real world and explore things actually that can be very difficult to explore in a real world context. So deeply troubling aspects of our history, deeply troubling aspects of our politics, deeply troubling aspects of human behavior, when we place them in a science fictional world and explore it, or a fantasy world and explore it, we're giving both ourselves and our readers that sort of psychic barrier between them and the thing as a way to start thinking about it without knee-jerk reactions, without the impulses that we have been trained either by culture or by politics or whatever thing that we have learned, that it gives us a chance to explore it in a new way outside of that.
Like, and just like narrowing down a little bit more on the point you're talking about how like in fantasy specifically you're able to like talk about things that are difficult to talk about in real life, like for instance Game of Thrones. And like Game of Thrones it talks about topics of like incest, and talks about like betrayal, all these things that like it would be difficult to like talk about, and you can explore it from the perspective of like a brother and a sister who are in love. Like, I still think it's gross, but like, you get my point. Like, it was in a setting where it is safe to talk about it or explore the idea itself. And just like getting into a bit more, you were talking about how people are like influenced by like their politics and like their upbringing and everything. And me and Taylor, we spoke a little bit about it before the live stream started, but you were talking about like some implicit biases that writers sometimes have in their writing. And I wanted to know specifically, right? It's easy to say, okay, well, as a writer, you should be more self-aware so that like those kind of biases do not affect the quality of your narrative. But as a writer specifically, what can a writer do to, you know, to be conscious of it and not fall into that trap?
Well, obviously, every writer is different. Every writer should be exploring the thing that they want to explore. I don't think writing according to a checklist is ever going to help anyone. But when you think about it, let's say you're going to create a fantasy story, and you go, I want a setting. I'm going to create a city. So I just need a city. And you imagine a city. And you imagined it like an ancient Greek city, because that's the image you have in your head of a fantasy city. Why did you imagine ancient Greece? Oh, well, that's just what a fantasy city looks like. Well, why ancient Greece? Why did you pick ancient Greece as that? Why not an ancient city in Nigeria? Why not an ancient city in China? Why not an ancient city somewhere else? Why does it even have to be an analog for somewhere in the real world? Why not draw different things from different places? And you go, well, I'm now going to put people in this city. And, you know, we had a spate of a lot of fantasy writing, which was pseudo-European medieval history, where everyone was white, apart from an orientalized other character who came in. And you go, well, why was that? Oh, well, the European Middle Ages, everyone was white. And you go, not according to the archaeological evidence and not according to the actual histories, that Europe was much more diverse from that. But there was a popular image of it that everyone was white. So all of these fantasy stories, everyone was white. And no one batted an eyelid because, oh, it's a fantasy world. It's kind of like medieval Europe. And we all think of medieval Europe as being white. And no one thought about it. But if you're in control of creating that world, then why would you put just one ethnicity in it? And you could have a very, very good reason for it. But it's being aware of your reason is the important thing. If you're going to have, oh, well, I want to have this character fall in love. Is it heteronormative? Have you assumed that everyone in your world is heterosexual? Why would everyone in your world be heterosexual? I'm going to make this character do X. The types of behavior that we think of as normal. And this is where our own personal backgrounds, where we live, where we grew up, what time period we grew up in, our personal politics, the socioeconomic groups we're part of, all of these things feed into our perception of what is normal. And if we replicate that as a base norm into a fantasy setting, we are replicating what we assume is normal. But obviously, our readers are from completely different backgrounds. And when they read that, they're not going to necessarily read it as normal because their normal might be different to my normal. And so with fantasy and science fiction in particular, authors have this incredible opportunity to create a world, to play with the very constants that we assume are universal. So if you have a kingdom, why is it called a kingdom? Make it matrilineal and it's called a queendom. And people go, oh, well, you're just putting that in because blah, blah, blah. You go, but if it's matrilineal, then it makes sense that no one thought of it ever as a kingdom, that they would have thought of it as a queendom or invent a fantasy world for it. Why would this realm be matrilineal? You go, because in its history, there were so many civil wars fought because there were all of these pretenders to the throne. Whereas if we know who the mother is, we can guarantee we know who the child is because it's going to run down through the female line. Whereas she might have had an affair with someone. You don't know 100% who the father is. So that history, a violent history of civil wars, could explain why this particular monarchy became matrilineal. And suddenly that adds a depth and a verisimilitude and a mimesis to your world. It makes it easier to believe in, more authentic, easier to suspend your disbelief because there's a rationale, there's a logic. And you go, right. And if a queen is always in charge, what ramifications would that have? Would we still have the same structural sexism where wisdom is associated with the wise old man? If it's always a queen, would we not now flip that? And if we flip that to now wisdom is going to be associated with an older woman, how does that change what the archetype is going to be? How is that going to change the dynamics? Am I going to play with this? And by altering and playing with supposed universal norms, you can actually generate incredibly intricate and fascinating story worlds. The ramifications of changing just one thing can ripple through the entirety of it to give you this entire palette of choices about your world and your story and what you want to tell, and make it individual, all by altering just maybe one little tiny thing and thinking about how that might actually change the world.
I want to read that book. Wait, the book you just described. Someone write that. I'm here for it.
Like,
That's and it's funny that I feel that typically writers today, when approaching when making an attempt to make their stories rich, culturally, ethnically, religiously diverse, having representation, marginalized people of all different backgrounds, customs, etc. I feel that there's typically one of two approaches, the categories that you tend to fall into. I love AP's, what AP said about the aspect of simply making it organic. So, as in the real world, naturally, there's people who, are identify as being LGBTQIA plus. There's people of different cultures, colors, races, etc., religions, and having that as being very natural, and versus I think especially for a lot of marginalized writers, to draw attention to the fact that the world is a place, unfortunately, that has lots of positive things, but also has bigotry, racism, persecution against people of different sexual preferences, et cetera, and approaching it from dealing with the problems that we have with that natural, organic way that that AP spoke about. So I think you'll find a lot of times it's one or the other. You'll read a book where of course the main character is gay or bisexual, and because that is reality, and there's nothing wrong with it, and it's just part of the narrative, right? And the head of state is a queen. That's just part of the narrative. It's natural. Versus authors who address and compare it to our real world, where unfortunately in some people and in some places in the world and in some unique groups within the world, that would be an issue. So I know for someone like me, of course, I approach it from the aspect of hey, we have some problems, Houston, and these are some of the things that our humankind has grappled with and struggled with for centuries, and we still haven't gotten it right. So that's why in my books it's much more in your face. It's much more it's much more overt in terms of there's racism, there's sexism, there's homophobia, there's colonialism, there's all these issues. But I do enjoy reading books where again it's not there's an absence of issues, but those issues are not pointed out to the same degree. There's other poignant things going on, but those aren't one of them. So I enjoy both because I think we need both. I think we need both types of books, where our societal issues are laid bare for all to see, and that because obviously we need some help as humans to go through these things. And I also love and it's not a utopian, like, oh my gosh, everybody gets along and everybody's happy and this is just, kumbaya. It's about, I think we all want to envision a time where, or a place analogous to our world, that these things are not an issue, right? Because I think as human beings, that's what we're all striving for, right? We're striving for that. We want to get to that place. We feel that we're en route. We feel that it's a journey, an evolution towards that. But hopefully we get there one day.
Yeah, and you so eloquently pointed out that, again, like as I said at the end, this is not meant to be prescriptive because there are so many different stories. There's so many different ways of telling stories, and having a world that replicates a lot of these assumed base norms and challenging them with the narrative, with characters within the narrative who are fighting against that. That's a very overt, brilliant way to bring it to the fore. And it's very different to what I was just describing by trying to create something different by envisaging changing the base norm to see how that ripples out. And they're just different ways of trying to find the best way to communicate your narrative. What is it that you want to do? What is it that you want to tell? And even at the beginning, pointing out that, show don't tell works for as a general rule for X, but every novel is always moving between show and tell. You will never find I don't think you will ever find an entire novel length work that is only ever show. There will always be elements of tell. And it's playing with the techniques. It's understanding how the technique works. And I think one of the reasons that show don't tell is emphasized, particularly in writing workshops, is because a lot of beginning authors tell so much that they leave nothing up to the reader. And trimming that away to give a reader the room to immerse themselves, to engage themselves instead of being dictated to, is one of the reasons I think that rule gets talked about so much. But as everyone knows, there are always styles of stories where someone tells you a story, the oral tradition, even mimicking aspects of that, the stories that we tell each other about what happened last night or our friends and what they did. Those fall very much into tell forms, and they're very natural forms. They're very easy forms to listen to and to accept. And so knowing how you play with it is exactly the point. It's not that you must never tell, you must only show. It's knowing what showing does. It's knowing what telling does. And as we said at the very beginning, it's when you break those rules or when you change those rules, knowing what that effect is. And because you know it and you can deploy it when you want, you are trying to essentially manipulate your reader. Because let's face it, authors are all liars. Very pretty and talented liars, but you're all liars.
We are.
That actually connects to something that Epic had mentioned, I think, in our previous live we did last at the Friday Conversations. You were talking about how you wanted to create a narrative where you were co-creating with the reader and not just, telling them what they should think about your story. That really seems to connect to what AP just said. And as a reader, it's interesting. I've had moments where I've thought, oh, I'm glad that the author trusts me here. It's a weird word to use, but I've actually had the thought, like, the author is trusting me to connect A to B. And as a reader, that's a wonderful experience to not feel like you're just being, talked to. So.
Yeah, I've experienced both ends of the spectrum, and as a reader, when I'm like consuming a book, I enjoy it a bit more when I am figuring things out for myself, and then maybe later on get a confirmation if I was right or wrong. And that, like, if I'm following a book enough to keep up with the story that the writer is telling, even if it's not like spoon feeding me all the information himself, then it's a different depth of engagement that I am experiencing. But then, then you read a book like The First Law, you read a book like Beyond Redemption, where I feel like they do a lot of telling, especially in terms of like the interiority of what's going on in a character's mind. And you're like, wow, that was really well done. I've experienced the effect and I like it. And then you read a book like Blood Song, where it's everything is only through is only through dialogue and through the actions of the main character that you know anything about them, and it is very, very effectively done as well. So it just goes back to the same thing. If you're going to do something like and you're writing, just make sure it's intentional.
Yeah. I just so appreciate the fact that every writer can write something completely different and have their own unique audience that loves that work. And I always talk about this, I see peeking back over AP's shoulder. I believe it's To Ride Hell's Chasm by Jenny Wurtz. I think it's one of if not my favorite author and someone who I consider a friend. And that for me is the greatest standalone book I've ever read to date. Steve and I were privileged enough to have Jenny on a previous episode of Page Chewing. Actually, I was speaking to her earlier, and Jenny writes with a richness of language that I believe is unparalleled. I mean, I'm old now. I've read a lot of books, and I've read a lot of fancy books, and some of my favorite authors, the GRMs and etc. But Jenny Wurtz does something with language that I have not found, anywhere else. In terms of literature, and I say that as the highest compliment, right? But I can read a book like Jenny's that is so completely, intricate in terms of language. It's so it's beyond lyric or poetical. It's the way she plays with words, and it's the deeper meanings and the nuances and the layers in what she does. And then I can read, something like, I started to read, just glance at a Will White a book the other day. Again, I've never read his stuff. I had it. I picked it up. I started taking a few reads, and great writer, but a totally different kind of book. Will Wright, as an indie author, is a New York Times bestselling author. That's no small feat. But to be able to appreciate two so very different books, written in such a vast, drastically different style, and to be able to love and appreciate them both. That's what I love about literature. I remember in school, another one of those, writing rules: don't write first person. It's weak writing. You know what I mean? So many of my favorite books are, some of my favorite authors, Bernard Cornwell, etc., all first person, right? These are international best-selling books, and so I think to AP's point, to Epic's point, to his point, I mean, I think it's just, if you write effectively, people are gonna love your books, regardless of what narrative perspective you use, regardless of how intricate your prose is versus a lighter touch, whether it's character driven, whether it's plot driven. If your book is good, people are gonna like and read it, right? And I think that's what we as authors are all striving for in our own unique ways. We're striving for that audience that's going to appreciate and like our narrative voice, right? It takes a while to gain that voice as an author. You don't get it after book one. You might not get after book three, but eventually, typically, you develop it. And that's one of the things I enjoy the most about being an author and a reader.
And it's one of those things, as a reader, you want to find those authors that it's the latest book by so and so. Well, that's a must buy, because no matter what they do, I know I'm going to enjoy it. And then you have authors who are chameleon-like, that they change their styles and their approaches. And one of the most fascinating things, talking about playing with language, one of the things I studied back at university when I was young, it did happen once.
I feel you, AP. I feel you.
But we studied Anglo-Irish literature, which is more commonly called now Irish literature in English, to avoid the Anglo-Irish label. But it was a lot of the Irish authors who were writing in English. And there's a concept in colonial theory about adopt, adapt, adapt. And this idea of the dominant culture comes in and conquers, and they go, this is what you do. So you adopt it. And then you kind of get it and fit it with what you're doing, and you become good at it. And then you go, right, now I'm going to manipulate it and do what I want to do with it. And let's play around with it. And some of the Anglo-Irish authors were so aware of the use of the English language. And I think it was in Murphy. And the line is something like, and Murphy walked into a mew, M-E-W. And the word in English is obviously mews, M-E-W-S. It's a plural. And it comes from the fact that that's stables, because that was one of the words for a set of stables, multiple stables. But it now means a passageway. And so the word gets changed. He deliberately changes it and removes the pluralization because it's one street. And it's that awareness, that ability as someone who is looking at it and going, no, I'm going to play with the language. And we can have authors who write beautiful, lyrical, poetic prose. Guy Gavriel Kay, a lot of his work has wonderful, rich, poetic prose. Then we can have authors like Stephen Erickson, who it's less lyrical, but he's still using the same poetic devices. You have authors like Robin Hobb and Johnny Wurtz, again, very aware of the language that they are using. And then you'll have other authors who go, no, I want very clean, clear, transparent, to the point language. I want to make this as accessible at the lowest entry level possible into literacy to get my story across. I want all of that in it. And they have a different style. And not any of these are, this is good, that is bad. It all depends on the narrative, the intention of the author, the style of narrative that they're talking about, the intended audience, who they are speaking to. All of these things play into it. And we can love straightforward, bare prose. We can love beautifully embellished prose. We can love intricate, complex, dense prose. But if you have really dense prose and you go, it doesn't really fit with this story. And sometimes we get that feeling as well, that the style isn't matching the narrative, or it's not matching our expectation, and that affects how we read.
Something I also think is important as a reader is to make sure you're reading different styles. Like, I don't know if you can tell, but I like Brandon Sanderson. Surprise, okay. But his style is very straightforward to reach as many people as possible. Very clean, very crisp kind of writing. But I actually just recently read A Drowned Kingdom by PL, and I filmed a wrap-up where I'm going to talk about this. But I did say that there's a lot of SAT words in that book. Like, you will not find the same adjective used twice. And I mean that in a really good way. It was refreshing for me as a reader to see. I actually had to look up a word or two when I was reading, and it had been a while since I'd had that experience in fantasy. So even though reading something like Brandon Sanderson is easy to pick up, I think it's important for readers to try to read other styles, to challenge themselves in that way. Another example you gave was Robin Hobb. I don't know how to describe the way her writing makes me feel. It's just, her sentences are cozy. I don't know any other way to describe that. I'll read a sentence and it won't be in a cozy setting, but I'll feel like, oh, those words sounded nice together next to each other. And it's not describing anything that warrants that feeling, but the words themselves make me feel that way. So, it's just important to make sure that you have different aspects of writing that you're engaging with, that you're playing with, as an author, or not just as an author, but as a reader as well.
And to your point about reading widely within a genre is good. Reading other genres is even better. And reading other genres from other time periods, that's best of all, because there are so many times I hear people potentially new to the genre, or who are writing, and they go, I've never seen this done before. And I go, well, I can point out a couple of books from the early 20th century that do it. And it's a lack of awareness that, like, a lot of this stuff has been done, or it's, this book shouldn't do this. And you go, well, why not? Well, that's not how stories should be told. Funnily enough, I know a couple of examples of that working in highly successful books, just not as commonly in fantasy. And when we see these books from other time periods, other cultures, other genres, they explore techniques and ways of writing and ways of expressing themselves that challenge us, that make us grow as readers, expand our vocabularies, expand our knowledge of what happens in a story. And they are the best education. As much as I would love everyone to go to university and study English literature because it's my passion, the best education is reading widely and looking at all of those stories. And it is such an amazing experience to see changes and trends over time. Psychological realism was not a big thing in stories until it was. And then suddenly it's all characters have to be psychologically real. And there is almost like a switch moment in the late 19th century to the early 20th century where psychological realism becomes a norm, and it's suddenly in everything. And when we talk about within the genre, we now have this opportunity with so many different voices for a genre that had its roots in a very traditional form of publishing and with a very traditional sort of outlook on things. We now have younger authors, older authors. We have authors from countries all over the world. Their work is being translated into English, or they are writing in English. We have books that are set in different locales and are challenging us. And we live in an absolute golden age of fantastic stories being told. And it is sometimes slightly disheartening when fans are about, well, no, I just want to read this thing again. And it's the same thing over and over again. And that can be very comforting. We all have comfort reads. We all have things that we sort of default to as the thing that we like. But being challenged by stories is one of the greatest feelings in the world.
Speaking of which, just listening to you talk about stories just makes me want to pick up a book. Like, I feel like if I was having a reading slump, I could just go to your channel, just pick a video at random, and just be like, ah, yes, this is why I enjoy reading. Let me pick something up.
Yeah, I echo that absolutely, AP. That's you're incredibly inspiring when it comes to that. Of course, that's also because you're also incredibly knowledgeable and open-minded. Oh, and Taylor, I have to say thank you. I'm humbled that you would say that about my work. I feel like, part of what, and Steve posted a phenomenal video. I encourage anybody who hasn't seen it to watch it, about what is Grimdark. And Grimdark,
sorry, Steve's face is like, what?
yeah. Well, that was a fabulous, really insightful video. And to AP's point about psychological realism, Grimdark in particular, I think, as a subgenre in fantasy, is something that, I mean, we're struggling to define it. In some ways, it's very controversial. Does it even exist? But I think Steve had been on the same thought process, that part of the attraction of Grimdark is you're looking for that psychological realism that AP refers to. You're looking for that, the books I read, I'm 53 now, so the books I read, classical books, or actual classics, the Iliad, Milton, Paradise Lost, some of them had great character work. If you really dig into some of the books that I studied at university, the Morte Arthur, Thomas Mallory, they had great character work, but it was always overshadowed by, it stopped short of really delving into, that holistic view of how people thought and their reactions to certain things and their quote unquote darker traits. And as now in our world, where I feel in some ways we're becoming so much more open about discussing things. We're becoming so much more open about our mental health issues, about our challenges. People are looking more and more for that holistic view of what we are as human beings. And I think that's part of what in fantasy Grimdark is doing so well, because you have these characters that are so real, flawed, gray, so some questionable morals, but also very real. Some really great attributes and nobility and courage and all these other things, but complex, characters that have experienced trauma, characters that have been psychologically, mostly physically abused, characters that, have that their ambitions are raw and naked and it's unashamed, and, their inner fears and insecurities. And that's compelling, right? That's compelling to read. Right, because as I always say, I love J.R. Tolkien. I love reading Lord of the Rings, but I want to know what I want to know what Aragorn thought about other races and cultures. I want to know what Aragorn thought about people who did not identify as heterosexual. And although I will read that book and 9 times out of 10 never think about that, if I now looking back as a 53-year-old reader and writer, that would have been fascinating. Of course, that's not the book that J.R. wrote, and I'm not expecting that he would have wrote that. But wouldn't that have been fascinating to see that? And I think that's what we're looking for more now with our fantasy in particular. So,
and N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy, it's stunning trilogy. Now, I have a confession. I am a huge fan of book one. and I'm not as big a fan of the later two. Absolutely adored. Thought it was one of the best books ever written when I was reading it. I just absolutely amazing. I still think it is an amazing trilogy and people should read it. But I was blown away by book one. And I think like Jemison is an incredibly talented author. And we Seth Dickinson, I think one of the books is behind me right there. Seth Dickinson's the Trader Baru Cormorant was again another one of these books that I read, and it blew my socks off because it was another fantasy book that was new, that was different, that was approaching telling these fantasy stories, and what they were telling with them was different. And the fact that we live in this day and age where we have such variety, where you have stories that challenge our perception, where you have stories that show us how things can be. Like we think back utopian and dystopian fiction as genres. We still see elements of that. The psychological realism of characters, but we can have the hyper-violence being celebrated or hyper-violence being criticized. That the violence inherent in or the violence that's depicted in a book is not necessarily the defining characteristic. It's how that violence is treated. And you can have very, very violent stuff depicted in gruesome detail, but depending on what the narrative is doing with that, that could be condemning it, or it could be celebrating it. And that's the flexibility of stories that we were talking about at the beginning, that depending on what an author wants to do with these elements, how they want to explore them, that narrative is incredibly powerful in showing us other people's perspectives, other people's ways of moving through the world, other people's views of the world. And it can challenge our biases, whether they are unconscious, that we didn't realize that we had, or maybe it can help us reaffirm our position on something because we go, you know what, actually, seeing it now laid out in a different way, I do still have this belief that literature is not just about entertainment. We read for entertainment. We can read for escapism. We can read for knowledge. We can read for experience. There are so many different ways to read. And it's not that this book is for education. This book is just for enjoyment. We can draw on all these different experiences when we read. And that's why the diversity of authors we have now, the diversity of stories we have now, is so incredibly important. And different styles, different approaches, this richness, a giant tapestry of genre now that's not made up of the same old threads running through it. We have an enormous tapestry made up of different threads, of different colors, of different textures that give us this genre that we love. So
let's get through a couple of comments really quick. Nathaniel says, hi, Steve, Epic Taylor, AP. I wish I could recover from academia. Oh, we're feeling better, AP. Kayhout says, late night for me then. Our friend Philip is here. We are a storytelling animal.
Oh, my nemesis.
Yeah. Say how it all looks. I got to listen to AP talk about narrative construction and Thomas the blew my understanding of stories. And Brush to Canvas. Hello, Brush to Canvas. Our friend Layla is here. Hey, Layla. Hope you're doing well. Layla's been joining us on the Malazan discussions. It's been really great time with her. Philip says, cultures with primary oral formulatic modes of storytelling have ideas about story structure very different from what many of us expect. Yeah. Pax Panic is here. Wishes of a happy string. Hey, Pax. And AP, the question, are there some narrative models that are more prevalent now than in the past? It seems to me that metaphysical romance, Hayden White, isn't always popular.
Well, it depends on the genre. And I have noticed there has been a movement towards almost structuring your chapters and your style of writing in a very visual, auditory way. almost as if they are writing to a TV format. And, that can work really, really well. George R. R. Martin does a lot of that in his writing. He writes very much in that cinematic mode. That is not the be-all and end-all of literary expression. And I think sometimes we fall into a trap of thinking that should be how we write. We should be writing so that I can sell my novel to a production company and they can turn it into a TV show. But is that the best method for your story? Is that the best way to communicate? It's not that it is bad, but it's only one way of doing it. And types of writing and styles of writing go in and out of fashion all the time. The new weird and the construction of the deconstruction of fantasy tropes, bringing a lot of horror elements and bringing a lot of the politics in. That rose and it kind of dissolved as a counter genre to a lot of stuff that was going on in fantasy. We've seen the rise of popularity of grimdark, but now that's sort of dispersed through the genre as a new general approach to how we depict violence or what we're depicting violence for and the different reasons. And none of that is new. The violence in fantasy has been there from the very beginning. Reading the old Conan stories, they were incredibly violent for the time, but we've become a lot more desensitized to violence. So we've kind of dialed it up to 11 in certain stories because some of our reactions to it have become numb. So styles and trends. Anytime someone says, oh, you can't do that anymore, no one will like it. Guaranteed next year, a book will come out that will be that thing and it will be a bestseller and will suddenly flood the market. And then you'll have hundreds of imitators and they won't do it as well. And then you go, oh, well, that form is now dead. And then someone else will do it. And you go, stop proving me wrong.
I think there's no, and it's fine that Nathaniel referred to meta-historical romance. I need to find the book. I'm not going to go deep diving now, but self-published fantasy. So Taylor and I are both honored to be judges. Spirit, I'm speaking for Taylor, but honored to be judges in the current iteration of the self-published fantasy blog off, essentially created by Mark Lawrence. And I believe, and Nathaniel, I need to find this book. It's not in our blog. There's something that I remember reading the blurb. I can't remember if it's what blog it's in. It hit me as being almost like meta-historical romance. And there's a lot more romance books in this version of SPFPO. In the previous one, we had essentially romance fantasy, 2 romance fantasy books come in the top 2. And I think the one thing that to AP's point about trends, everybody's trying to catch the hottest trend, and then people say, oh well, that won't work, and then suddenly becomes the new hottest trend. I think nowhere else is that more evident than in self-published fantasy. If you want to see those stories that you're wondering, why can't I find a story about this? Get it, pick up self-published fantasy, because the diversity of the types of subgenres and writing and stories is just unparalleled. Stuff that you just and I read some books and I'm like, wow, how could I not have heard of this book, and this author? And hence my shelf keeps filling up with more and more self-published fantasy books. And I'd like to hear Taylor's impression, because I don't know, Taylor, I think she's said before that obviously in the past she predominantly read traditionally published book, and now she's found this whole cachet of great self-published fantasy, including Legacy of the Bright Wash was that second place book in last year's SPFBO, which is a romance. Romance is a big element. It's gaslight grimdark, but romance is big. And Taylor has an amazing video review of Legacy of the Bright Wash. But yeah, so I want to hear Taylor's perspective. But yeah, I think self-published fantasy, particularly where you can see that those stories you're looking for, that you're wondering, you can find it. You can find it there. So.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So Lana's not with us today, but she's a good friend of ours as well. And she runs something called the India Chords Readathon that I joined 2 years ago now. Oh my God, what is time? How has that been 2 years? But about 2 years ago. And that is what showed me like the iceberg of self-published fantasy, you know, how deep it goes and how much there is. And I definitely agree that there's a lot more freedom and different types of storytelling. I've already read books that have things I had never seen before. And the amount of self-published books I've read is small compared to the amount of traditional published books that I've read. That is definitely true. And to talk about different genres and kind of the flux and flow of them, something interesting I'm noticing is grimdark is huge. And I think AP made a really good point in that it's kind of disseminated into just some aspects of it are just what we expect in fantasy now. So I think after that trend, though, it's certainly not over and it'll exist for a very long time. But I do think I'm noticing as a reader, the things that I'm seeing people pick up and interested in is almost in contrast to that. So cozy fantasy, romance, like when I've always enjoyed romance in my books, but whenever I would bring that up before, it was scoffed at, depending on who I'm talking to. But it could be seen as lowering the value of a book. But now I'm noticing people are more open to it. And I have no evidence for this whatsoever, but my guess is that some of this is coming in response to the new standard of like violence and grappling with real world stories or real world issues in fantasy. So I think there's almost a desire to find a cozy corner. So Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldtree, like that book exploded. And the poor guy just posted it on Twitter and was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm sorry, you know, because it exploded in a way he didn't expect. So I do think that while everything does exist, the popularity of certain trends play off of each other. So if something is big for a long time, maybe people are going to look for the opposite because they want something that feels refreshing. You know, when something becomes not oversaturated, that's the wrong word to use, but becomes prolific, people might look for something else.
But even within fantasy, think of the impact J.R.R. Tolkien had, The Lord of the Rings, and we had a number of different works. Terry Brooks' Sword of Shannara, Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, Stephen Donaldson's Thomas Covenant, Terry Goodkin's Sword of Truth were so heavily influenced by, and sometimes these authors were trying to replicate Tolkien, and other times argue against it. And we saw that in reactions to Tolkien trying to do something different. And so there's an expression here, swings and roundabouts, that something becomes a dominant form and therefore people try to replicate it, but other people try to argue against it. And this is how genres evolve and they grow and they flourish. Then they become so dominant that people go, well, it's oversaturated. We've reached peak fantasy. It's time for something else, and something else will rise. And we see this with genre discussion all the time, that the Western, for a while, the Western was the form of cinema. It dominated cinema. Then there was, for a period of time, the rise of the horror movie. We had all those slasher movies. Now is the time of the superhero. And I think since about 2008, there's been at least one article every year that says, have we reached peak superhero? Have we reached superhero saturation? Since 2008. But eventually, interest in superheroes will die off and something else will fill that void. And when we think of Tolkien, hobbits really didn't exist below the neck down. There are very few mentions of anyone with bits below the waist. And that influenced the genre. And then people went, well, why? And the Guy Gavriel's Tegana is highly sexual in places. So it's not that a lot of these things are new. It's quite often they're new to us because a lot of what we've been reading has not featured them. And then we, as we so often do, universalize our experience and think that is the norm. And we project it outward and go, oh, but that's what it is, because I've read 20 books, and from those 20 books, none of them did this, therefore that must be the norm. And I have a good sample, 20 books. And it can surprise us when we realize the variety of stuff that is out there. And the independently published, the authors who are self-published, are going out there and they are telling exactly their stories. And this was the diversity that I was talking about earlier. And whether someone is traditionally published or not, when you find that story that speaks to you personally, it is like something resonating in your soul, that you go, how did that author know me so well that they wrote this thing that speaks so directly to me? And because readers are active participants in the creation of narrative, and this is something I think people overlook. Authors write a story, authors write it down, but when we as readers approach it, we take those squiggles on the page, we take those symbols, and we bring them into our brain, and we give them meaning. We create these worlds. We are co-creators of these worlds with the author in making them come alive in our heads. And it is a very intimate act, and it is a very active act. And because of that, that is why we can get so invested. And when we find those stories that feature characters that speak directly to us, or characters that we connect with in some way, that we can experience that emotion, or something that drags us along, that can be so powerful and really get down inside you. And no one can tell you ahead of time what that story is going to be. And that's the beauty of all of these stories coming out.
Yeah, I'll let Steve answer those questions first before I.
Camp Cake says every time I listen to AP talking about anything, I feel like he has literally no idea about where he's going, and yet when he finishes, I feel a huge void in my soul that keeps me thinking.
Well, what a compliment! Yeah, very, very true.
And AP had a thought on Grimdark and the kind of the rise of the darker types of stories. Did you see a trend in the culture of the time period of TV shows like Mad Men or Breaking Bad or The Sopranos, that time period? Do you see a correlation there between the popularity of those types of stories on TV in that media versus the kind of the rise of the darker toned fantasy books in particular?
I don't necessarily know I would draw a direct correlation between specific TV shows and the rise of fantasy. But if you look at the level of violence that we accept in TV shows, the 1980s was full of very hyper-violent action movies. 1980s was full of violence. And then when we get into the 1990s, a lot of that violence is now in TV shows, that we now accept a certain level of violence. So take something like one of the CW superhero shows, something like Arrow, the Green Arrow show. Now, think of season 1. That's about Oliver Queen arriving back, having been presumed dead, and he has a kill list. And he is going to go around town and he's going to assassinate people. He is going to kill them. And they have lots of fights, and he is killing people. That's the entire plan. And now, go back to the 1980s and imagine pitching that to a TV producer. Right, I have this show aimed for sort of 12 to 16-year-olds, and it's going to be about this guy who's presumed dead. He's going to arrive back in town, and he has a list, and he's going to go around every week and try and assassinate people. And they go, oh, so who's the hero that's going to stop him? No, he is the hero. Now, obviously, the show evolves from there. That's not the be-all and end-all of the show. But imagine going back to the 1980s and trying to pitch that as a teenage show. And then think, well, how has our perception of violence changed that we now think that level of violence is appropriate for children?
I wrote a guest blog on Stony the Guider, great writer, intellectual person, about the rise of Grimdark, a couple of years going back now. And to AP's point, I also believe there was a purposeful. George R. R. Martin, one of my favorite writers, states implicitly. He says, "Listen, J.R.R. Tolkien is my iconic writer, my hero. But one thing that I didn't appreciate about his writing is that I wanted the grit, I wanted the realism, I wanted the flawed, gray dirtiness of what essentially he was talking about, more medieval type fantasy sense we're all about. I want that, the the all the lecherousness of the king, and all the barbarity of the fighting, and all of the, you know, the horrible brutality of the political machinations. He wanted that plainly for all to see, and it was in direct response to what he believed was a more sanitized version of someone like a Tolkien. Great writing, of course. Again, Tolkien is Jerem's hero, but you know, I do believe that there was a distinctive. I think Taylor had mentioned almost like a purposeful backlash. The way now, you know, Taylor mentioned, you know, the cozy fantasy is becoming more and more, you know, popular, almost in response to, okay, well, when you read, you know, Michael R. Fletcher or Sarah Chorn or even my book, you may need to, you know what, let me read something a bit lighter after I've read 6 of these, right? After I've seen, you know, blood splat across the pages and people being traumatized and, you know, my favorite character dying bloodily. Let me just read something about, you know, something so innocuous and just, you know what I mean? And I do think that, you know, I agree that I think as human beings, we have this tendency to go, I really want to binge on this horror. AP mentioned, you know, Friday the 13th, Michael, you know, slashing, dismembering people, and it's all cool. And then, you know, Carrie, and then suddenly we want to back off and watch, you know, superheroes that are indestructible. I can never be killed. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think maybe part of it is that as human beings, we are somewhat reactionary to things, and we don't realize when we become so immersed in one particular type of thing, then it's almost so, oh my God, well, I can't take that anymore. I need an antidote almost to this. So I need to go off and read light and fluffy. So,
but and one of the things that we always forget is that while we talk about fantasy and say the rise of grimdark, it's not that grimdark exists in a vacuum. We had Vietnam War fiction. We had Korean War fiction. A lot of that was entering the mainstream. We had the rise of political thrillers and the legal thriller, like John Grisham and Tom Clancy. You couldn't walk anywhere without those books being visible as, we have 100 copies and will be sold out in half an hour. And those things popularized different approaches. And authors and readers, we steal and borrow and soak in all of this from all around us. And, you know, even like the Korean fiction and the Vietnam War fiction, we can go back to the First World War. We can look at the rise of that darker, the undercutting of the patriotic view and the jingoistic view of war, this great and glorious combat, to look at the devastation of war. But that's First World War. If we want to talk about Machiavellian politics, well, we just used the word Machiavelli. Oh, where did that come from? When we want to talk about the sex and seduction of political maneuvering and people murdering each other, you know, Macbeth and Hamlet might come into play. That we exist in a giant, I think it was Terry Pratchett. So Terry Pratchett called it a cauldron of story, or he might have called it a gumbo. He was interviewed a number of times about this. But we exist in this giant sort of gumbo of story, and every author is drawing out these different elements. And because there are movements and trends, there are imitators and then reactions too. And for some reason, one will pick up steam, and we don't know why, and it'll become more popular, and suddenly that will become a focus, and it'll expand out. And then, for some reason, and we don't know why, it'll eventually contract, because nothing expands forever, despite what economists think about economies.
What's so interesting too about this is one of the reasons that I view a rise in grimdark specifically, and not just, you say it doesn't exist in a vacuum, and that speaks so true from my experience, because having been a lover of fantasy since I was young, it was not cool to like fantasy. It was not a thing that you would go out and you would say, hey, I'm a fantasy. It was not a good image. All right. So something I noticed is a huge shift after Game of Thrones, where suddenly fantasy could be cool because it was vicious. Like people saw it as like the uncool superhero kind of is the view that I got anyway. being a fan of it. And then after Game of Thrones, it was like, oh, I didn't know it could be like this. I didn't know people could stab each other in the back and it could be political. And I saw the exact same trend with manga or anime, which also was not cool. But then Attack on Titan came out, and that was huge in the West. And manga or anime has always had the genre of violence, genres that include violence and political, intrigue and deep characters and trauma. It's always been there. But the view was, well, not to bash Sailor Moon because I love Sailor Moon, but the view was Sailor Moon, spinning and magic and stuff. So I think I've seen a huge change outside of just the people who like this specific genre of book or movie. I've seen that expand and become suddenly cool in the last couple of years. And, I'm not bitter or anything, but it is something that is very clearly visible. And I don't know the source of that. I just know that there's a huge connection there.
I think we all like to be able to go, well, I liked it before it was cool.
Yeah, exactly. Excuse you.
But when we think about it, Game of Thrones, the TV show, was what made A Song of Ice and Fire cool to read. Not because, remember, A Song of Ice and Fire, the first books had been out for a while and they weren't cool until the TV show. And suddenly a broader mainstream audience saw it. And a bunch of them went, oh, this isn't what I thought fantasy was. Quite often because they thought of fantasy as the Disney movies, or they thought of fantasy as some sort of very sanitized, childish thing. And they hadn't realized what we've all been talking about in terms of, oh, this is an excellent fantasy novel. Oh, is it about some wizard? And they were dismissing it because of, no, and I mean this as in terms of lack of knowledge, but ignorance, not being aware of. But we do the same thing with so much. Like, I remember the first time I saw Akira and just going, like, I hadn't realized that an animated film could be like this. And like seeing Ghost in the Shell. And then someone showing me Urusaka Doji, and I went, I don't want to see films like this. Because that was not what I was expecting. I was expecting Akira, Ghost in the Shell, and not Urusaka Doji. But anime and animation, the different styles. Studio Ghibli, if you think of the adaptations that they've done of even Western stories, and so much of that is dealing with that trauma from World War II. That underpins a lot of the storytelling in some of those films. That there are these cultural trends, to return to one of the points that we're talking about an unconscious perception of reality, of what we are assuming is the thing that is normal for us to talk about, normal for us to feel, that infuses our stories. And with the rise of streaming, the rise of digital communication, being able to have a video chat with people all over the world simultaneously, this was not possible 20 years ago without a phenomenal amount of money. And now we treat it as matter of course. And yet, think of the impact that streaming has had on narrative structure. We can binge watch an entire TV show, the entire season, all in one go. Whereas we used to have to wait every week, and then there would be, and there's a break for 2 weeks because of this holiday or this sporting event, and then there's another few, and then there's a break because of this special event. And sometimes a 24 episode show would take all year for us to see, that it was all drawn out. We have become so accustomed now to everything being on demand. I have to wait 1 week to see the next episode. This is not right. Oh, that author wants to take some time to write their next book. Well, I'm not buying any of them until the last book is finished. You're so lucky you live in this time period. When I was
call out, I'm living for it.
When I was growing up, that wasn't an option. The fact that book, I had to go into my local bookshop, ask them, could they order books for me?
Yeah.
Because they wouldn't routinely stock them. Yeah. And it was, well, we can't get them in here. We might get them in 6 months. And you're like, okay, I'll wait. We have an instantaneous gratification problem. But that also goes to the styles of narrative that we like. We no longer want narratives that slowly take their time. Sometimes we go, oh, well, I want this faster. I want it faster. I need to know up front who the characters are, how the magic works, how this works. And this is actually part of the narrative construction that we are surrounded by, that we have absorbed, that we haven't realized that we've done. So sorry to barge in with that, but I liked fantasy before it was cool, was my main point.
Same here. I liked fantasy before it was cool. I just, yeah.
Where's the hair flip, Epic? You gotta do that.
Yeah, the hair flip going. That was awesome, Taylor. That was awesome.
Yeah.
I want to let Steve get to the questions again before I.
Sure. Writer of Things says, always a pleasure to hear AP talk. His esteemed company makes it that much better. Thanks for putting this together. Well, thanks for dropping by and spending time with us. Nathaniel says, gossip. T-Book Magic says, this is my first time hearing about writing rules, but I feel like all books would be the same if authors did an experiment / put their own twist on things, and that would be boring. Yeah. I recently read Freytag's whole text. It's really useful, minus his takes on national literatures. It has a bad reputation because people mostly read text about it and not the original text.
It's very important.
Nathaniel says, well, it's been argued that some Native American societies pre-contact were matriarchal despite their persistence of male leaders. Our friend Johanna is here. Johanna, I hope you're having a good Friday. Philip says, whereas critics are not liars or
Nemesis.
Our friend Fred to be read says, so often it's that ability or inability to walk this right line of showing / telling that can make or break a story for me. Let me see the queerdom and imagine that world without telling me everything. So don't be too heavy-handed. I think that's Nathaniel says, Barker's Stone Ships is an example of perhaps too much show. It has a matriarchal world, but it takes a while to figure out how it works. Some fireballs thrown, and I've only been listening for a couple of minutes. Jonas says,
Yes.
to write House Husband is amazing, almost finished. And Eric McLuhan is soon still working on Thousandfold Thought. He's making new places.
Thousandfold Thought is such a good book. Like, has anyone here apart from me and Steve read like R. Scott Baker book? Oh my God!
Listen,
Wow.
already, as Taylor says, you guys are giving me some serious FOMO here. I was organizing my book list the other day, and it's like, I have to get this R. Scott Baker stuff.
My
I'm
God.
literally on Goodreads right now, adding to Ride Hell's Chasm, so we're all on the same page here.
So, like,
We're all-
let me just, I just need to say something about this book that blows my mind. So, like, touching a little bit on what AP was saying about exploring ideas to expand them beyond what we are basically used to, like to kind of counteract our biases, turning our biases basically into strengths by expanding on decisions we might have made arbitrarily or that were expedient. But R. Scott Baker, and usually what I do as a writer is that I carry an idea that I hold or a belief I have, and then I introduce like a challenging belief, and I allow it to clash in the book, and then ideas come out of that, and you can go in any direction you want. R. Scott Baker talks like there's one point of view that is obviously like imposed on the character, on every character, on the whole story itself, but the way he writes it out, it's difficult to how he expresses it to, while at least while you're reading it, and when you pause every couple of minutes to like digest what you just read, it's like so intelligent. The philosophy, he draws from so many different philosophies to create this beautifully written like narrative and prose that he breaks so many rules in that book. It's like I watch all my rules. I'm like, I don't like exposition. I don't like exposition. I loved reading his exposition. Why? The prose was so neat and so good. So Thousandfold Thought, things get crazy. Like if we ever have an opportunity, I'd love to know what you think about it, Eric.
What are your thoughts on Baker, AP?
I've only read the first trilogy, and then the book, is it Neuropath?
Mhm.
Neuropath was one of the most disturbing, horrifying reads that I've ever, like, don't get me wrong, incredibly well written, but I wanted to go and shower my brain with bleach afterwards. It was a book that just reached into my brain, and I just was going, I don't want you there, go away. But I read that first trilogy, and I have to admit, I have to be in the mood to read R. Scott Baker's world, because it is incredibly challenging and dark and difficult, and it is exquisitely realized. His writing is really, really good. Like, he is very talented. Just on the metric of words on page, was that good word? Yes, word was good. Like, he has beautiful writing on the page. He has an exquisitely realized world. He challenges. One of the great things about fantasy is obviously literalizing metaphors or extending concepts to their most extreme, and that's part of what Baker puts on the page. This world is an extreme extension of some very prevalent beliefs in our world, and then infusing that with an approach to magic based on different aspects of philosophy and different ways of approaching and thinking about it. It is extraordinarily clever and good writing. It is not one that I go, you know what, I'm going to snuggle down and I'm going to tuck into this book tonight, because it is enormously rewarding. But like some of my favorite books, it's not one that I would casually just sort of, just read it for half an hour. I have to be in the mood for it, and I need to know going in, because there are some very disturbing scenes in it, and I wouldn't want anyone walking in unaware of that.
Yes, it's very fair to warn people. Like, yeah.
Sounds like exactly my kind of book.
And you know something, in also regard to something that AP was saying earlier about how you cannot just read a book. You can't read a book just for education, or just to there isn't one specific book just for education or just for entertainment or just for escapism. This R. Scott Baker, right? I find, and it's very rare where I find like enjoying a book as a writer way more than way more than I enjoyed as a reader, because like every sentence feels very, very intentionally written, and it's a different way to appreciate a book. Like, I enjoyed it as a reader, but I enjoy it way more as a writer. And I understand exactly what you mean when you say you need to put like a kind of like a disclaimer before you read it, especially in the later books where it even gets like so much darker. Because the one thing was that I was reading it with kind of like a reading group, so I just read all 3 books, and I was mind blown for like a month and a half. But it's if you enjoy dark fantasy, like, or grim dark, like, I feel like that is one very, I feel, defining book of what grimdark is, as like based on my understanding of it.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. I have to read that now. I think
we can buddy read it, PL. I haven't read it either, so
okay. It sounds like a plan. I'd love to.
Together.
That sounds like a plan.
For the first book, we're having a discussion for the first book next month. So
yeah, I can't wait for that. I have so much to say. I just have to be careful not to spoil anything, because I've read all 3 books, and I'm looking for people to listen to me talk right now.
Okay. Well, I again, it's funny that that Epic would say that it's after becoming a published author, and it happened. I think it was just organically that yes, you do start to read books differently than prior to becoming a writer, and I don't know if it's necessarily a more critical lens or an editorial lens. There's something about it, and I can't wait to hear what AP has to say as well. But there is something different now that I have my own books and my own ideas about writing and what makes a good book, and having written one versus prior to doing that. And one of the hardest things as a writer to accept, I think, is that once you write the book, and I say this is, it no longer belongs to you. It's weird. You have ownership and responsibility for your writing, but the book no longer belongs to you. Taylor's interpretation versus Steve's interpretation versus AP's versus Epic's of my book will be completely different. And they own that interpretation, and they can decide whatever they want about it, good, bad, or indifferent. And they can interpret the book completely differently than I wrote it. And that's something that is almost scary in a way too, as a writer, that you say, you go, wow, you know, like I didn't, you know, you read a review, it's like, but I didn't mean that when I wrote it, and that, but that's not yours anymore, right? That's the reader, rightly so, imposing their background, their experiences, and their interpretation of the book, and it's a weird feeling. But I guess on the other side of that, now as a writer, my interpretations are so different. The way I analyze a book is so different to prior than doing that, and I almost feel now I have to remember, almost like a switch. In my mind, I equate it to, I need to relax and just read the book and enjoy it, and not look at anything else. Just read it and enjoy it, and not think about, turn my writer brain off, and just enjoy the story. And I'm learning to do that better now. But at first it was really hard, especially when I was in the throes of editing, you know, especially line editing, right? And you're like, and then you read it, oh well, and yeah, I'm getting much better now. But that was one of my failings, that at first. But now I'm much better at just enjoying the story.
No, I'm like completely fine letting my mind go in two different directions. It's like I'm enjoying it, but I wish it was written better. Or wow, this is beautifully written, but like, am I really enjoying it? Like, I'm completely fine with that, because for me, what it helps me play with what the intentions of the writer was, and his execution of his intention, at least my postulations of what his intentions, and my understanding, or like lack of understanding of how he was able to like pull it off. So I go two different directions, but like when I'm trying to reconcile it, then I am able to like make like a descriptive booktube video about it, because I'm like playing off each like each appreciation of the book, like against itself. Yes.
So AP, with being an editor and having read so many books, do you ever wish you could just turn that part of your brain off and just read a book or watch a movie or a TV show, absorb any kind of story, and not have that part of your brain be dissecting it?
Yeah. I would say the major downside to studying and analyzing how stories function, when you really get into it and you start going into a lot of the different ways of breaking apart narrative, the downside to that is, think of how much of our entertainment is story based. So watching a film, watching a TV show, listening to an audiobook, listening to a radio play, reading a book, playing a computer game that has a narrative element, that suddenly all of these things, you sort of go, get me a very large Q-tip, and I'm just going to turn the brain off for a bit, reset. It can be difficult. And there are some very popular authors whose work, as much as I admire aspects of it, I don't enjoy reading their work, because there's either something about their style of writing, or their approach to something, or how they've gone about and done this, or I've spotted the story structure. I've spotted how they're interweaving plot A, plot B, and plot C. And I have recalled on a number of occasions reading a book, and partway through, I think it was halfway through book one, I not only predicted how book one would end, but how book two would end, and how the trilogy would end. And I read the entire trilogy. Like, the author still got their money from me, because it's only fair. And also, by the way, see people who buy books on Amazon for their thing and then return them. Don't do that. Amazon is not a lending library. Get a library card and get them from the library, because authors still get paid. Don't buy them from Amazon and then return them, because that ends up costing authors money. But anyway, back to my point. I read it and I was disappointed that it pretty much worked out 98% of what I'd figured out. And you go to watch a Marvel movie. A lot of the Marvel movies follow exactly the same pattern. And when you know that pattern, when you recognize that pattern, it's not as exciting. But there's still things about it that you can appreciate. And when you edit a novel, it's a different style and approach to reading than if I'm sitting there and going, I'm going to read this for fun. If I'm editing I try to do it on my computer, and I'm in a different mode. When I'm reading for pleasure, I try to do it with a physical book and sit somewhere else. When all of these different tricks to try and trick my brain into not applying the same techniques. But ultimately, when a book is incredibly well written, I can find it incredibly enjoyable, even if the story isn't that enthralling or the narrative events, I know what they're going to be. If it's well expressed, I lose myself in that. If it's not particularly well expressed, this is something that trips me up more. And it's a personal thing for me. But if it's not well expressed, I find that more difficult to read. But if it's written in a style that maybe would work better as an audiobook, there was recently a whole series of books, space opera series called The Expeditionary Force, that I listened to as audiobooks because they were wildly entertaining for me to listen to. But I knew I wouldn't enjoy reading them physically. And, it is a drawback to studying narrative, that you start seeing the bare bones and you start seeing the tricks. And sometimes it's harder for an author to fool you, because when you're reading through it and you go, oh, I get the subtext here, I see what you're highlighting here, give it 2 chapters. Oh, look, it's the reveal. Ta-da! You lose some of that. But then you gain satisfaction in going, that was actually really well played. I liked how they did that.
So AP, like, how satisfying is it when you feel like, oh, I've predicted, I know what's going to happen, and you still slog through it, and eventually, you get to a point where everything just like it's not what you predicted, and it just like blows your mind. Like it's such a good feeling. And what book did that for you? What book did that for you? I will read that book too. I want to dissect that.
But genuinely I try not to predict plot points. That is not what I am reading for. That's not what I'm trying to invest in, the moment that's on the page. And the idea of trying to figure out where it's going. It's unfortunate that some authors tend to are slightly heavy-handed on foreshadowing. And because you know the pattern, you know how that foreshadowing is likely to take place, and you play a game of probability. But as long as the moment is good, it is and I know it's cliched to say this, the journey, not the destination. If 99% of the book has held my interest, and then the ending was, yeah, well, I knew that was going to happen. I don't know how many times we have read a story or watched a film where the good guy beats the bad guy at the end. We knew it was going to happen. That's not a surprise. It doesn't need to be a surprise every time. A story well told is its own reward in a lot of respects. And again, I genuinely love stories that when I read them, I'm surprised. And then when I think back on it, I went, it was inevitable that it was going to end up that way. But I didn't spot it, you tricksy authors, you. And I love when that happens. I love when authors surprise me. I love when authors challenge the patterns that I'm seeing, and because they're aware of exactly the same patterns, and they go, oh yeah, but I'm going to subvert this one. And you can trip yourself up. Our reader expectations, what we map onto a book, that can radically change the book in front of you. Because if you're everyone must have experienced this. Someone's told you this film is very funny, so you sit down expecting a comedy, and you are sitting there going, I want to die. This is the worst thing that I have ever. How can anyone find this funny? And then your friend said, oh no, but I didn't mean comedy and sort of like a funny ha-ha sort of thing. I meant you know, it was amusing in an intellectual way. You go, well, I was expecting people hitting each other in the face with frying pans and slipping on banana peels. But our expectation when we go in with that, this film's really scary. So you go in expecting a scary film. Therefore, you're already inured to it. So the film has to be extra, extra scary for it to have any effect. Oh, this film is so blah. When people tell us so much about a story, we can create images. So if someone says this is an epic military fantasy, and you go, I know what epic means, I know what military fantasy means, I'm going to read this. And then they go, but there was only like one battle in this entire book. I thought you said this was epic military. It was just people talk. It was soldiers sitting around talking. You go, but because it didn't match the expectation. Now, does that mean that the book was bad? No, but our expectation can shape so much in how we approach literature that sometimes it's best going in almost blind to go, I'm just going to read the book. Someone said this was a good book, but they told me nothing about it. I sit down, I read it and go, yeah, that was a good book. Didn't know what was going to happen because I wasn't expecting anything. I wasn't doing that. So those are just my
Steve, just a real question. So on the book that shall not be named, or the series that shall not be named, do you think it was our expectations that ruined it for us?
Maybe, yeah. There's a popular
Probably.
that Epic and I tried to read. We just weren't fans of it, and I've gotten hate mail about it. But I think it may have been expectations that we expected something different than what we got. So it's possible.
Well,
I actually. Oh, sorry, AP. Did you want to?
No.
I recently was talking to a couple self-pub authors about marketing and how, as a reader, when you hear the way that a book is marketed, it's going to color what you expect from it, talking about expectations, right? So you can't see it, but I have the Six of Crows duology on my shelf up above. And that is like in the YA fantasy world, that is like the quintessential modern times, the quintessential duology to look towards for like a heist, found family heist story. It blew up. It's huge. And I also really love it. But after that, so many books were marketed as the new Six of Crows. And there is a book that I can think of off the top of my head, The Gilded Wolves, that is objectively, I don't think, not a bad book. But because I was expecting, so many people compared it to Six of Crows. So I went in like, I'm expecting these tropes. I'm expecting, the same kind of narrative structure. And that's not what it was. And so it's a prime example of me saying this book was not for me because of the expectations I went into it with. And marketing played a huge role in that because, it's traditionally published. So that was the tagline for the book. And I almost feel really bad for the author because I've heard many people had the same experience as me with that book. So I think talking to some of the indie authors about this, there's a debate as to whether you leave it really broad, just say, I write fantasy, read it, please. Or you say, like, I have this plot point, this vibe to my book, and set an expectation so that it can find the right readership. So the balance between those things, especially if you don't have a marketing team behind you, a lot of people were talking about how hard that can be.
Well, I'll give you two examples that sort of go to this. The first is, when sometimes you watch a trailer for an upcoming film, and after the trailer, you go, I know exactly what's going to happen. I've seen all the best bits of the film. I don't need to go and see the film. But the person sitting next to you goes, right, I know who the main characters are. I know what type of film it's going to be. I know what the best bits of the film are going to be. So now I want to go and see the whole thing. That people use that information in different ways. Someone wants to know ahead of time. And other people go, no, but why would I bother seeing it now? I've seen a 1.5 minute clip and I have actually just worked out what your entire film is and I'm bored. But think about something like The Lord of the Rings and the first book, Lord Foulsbane, of the Thomas Covenant books. And on one hand, you can say, yes, it's very Tolkien-esque. It's very like Tolkien. And someone who has just read The Lord of the Rings might go into that and go, oh, really? I guarantee you within the first 20 pages, they're going to go, how is this in any way like The Lord of the Rings? Because what they are thinking that The Lord of the Rings is, they have a list of criteria. And what you're thinking about The Lord of the Rings is you have a different set of criteria. So when I said earlier that, it's hard to deny the influence of The Lord of the Rings on the eye of the world. And people can either look at it as influence and inspiration, or they can look at it as replication, because Jordan was very consciously leaning into a lot of those elements. I don't think it's a disservice to him to be aware of that and to talk about it. It's not necessarily a bad thing. He does his own thing with it. But in terms of the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, which owes a lot as a reaction to Tolkien, and Eye of the World, which do you think is more like The Lord of the Rings? In terms of plot points, you might say The Eye of the World. But in terms of it being a sort of very adult, mature fantasy with a slower pace, you might mean the Thomas Covenant books. It all depends on when we say the next Game of Thrones or the next A Song of Ice and Fire. What do we mean by that? Because what I mean by it might be it's written quite cinemagraphically, that it's a lot of different point of view characters. And you're going, well, I thought you meant it was going to be full of sex and violence and twins getting it on. All depending on how you've characterized it. And that's why you can't blame marketing people for going, I want to suggest this is like the one that people know. One of the reasons we always keep going back to talking about Tolkien is we are almost guaranteed in a conversation about fantasy that people will be aware of Tolkien, whereas they might not be aware of Malazan. They might not be aware of The Wheel of Time. They might not be aware of the Shannara books. So we find common denominators, but how we understand those common denominators will again reflect an individual experience.
Yes, and this goes back to something Pierre was saying earlier about like how once a writer writes a book, it no longer belongs to them, because for each reader that reads that book, they are going to take different things away from it, and they are going to define it in the way that appeal to them the most. So to tell two different readers of the same book that another book is like the book they read in common is misleading.
Agreed. And I think, I believe Taylor said it. One of the things, Taylor, AP said that, I love that we authors, we're all liars, and, we're all, I mean, there's that balance, I think, as an author between thinking you're too smart for your own good, that you're going to outsmart the reader to, make them believe something that give them a red herring and lead them down a certain path. Hey, I admit it, I've tried it as an author. I think my book is full of red herrings that when you get to the end of a 7-book series, you're going to go, I had no idea this was, but that's my own hubris saying that, right? Meanwhile, people, I've had readers that said, oh, I think this is going to happen, and they've already figured it out. Like, oh my gosh, that's really astute of you, right? And it may not be spot on, but they've captured those elements, right? And I think it's a fascinating balance between AP's been talking about expectations, like what he mentioned about military fantasy. Okay, well, if you've been in the military, especially in peacetime, most of your military experience is sitting around swapping stories with your friends and not hand-to-hand combat, right? So when someone says, oh, it's a military fantasy, well, depending on your military experience, you may have spent 30 years in the military and never seen combat. So your military experience is different from someone who's, served abroad and done several tours and is, lived in trenches, and you know what I mean? So I think, yeah, expectations a lot, but also for writers, we have to remember that, give our readers credit. They're extremely intelligent, and sometimes we can outsmart ourselves in thinking that, again, we've there's no one that's going to figure out the subplot, and that's exactly the opposite, right? But as AP said, I think it's the journey, And as you get older, I think I'm one of the older people in the room, like along with AB, like as you get older, you realize more and more about just enjoying the moment, because you don't know how many moments you have left, right? And you when you pass 50 and you realize you likely have more years behind than ahead, you start thinking more and more about just enjoying this chapter. You know what? That's an interesting theory, but I just want to relax, enjoy the book, and be surprised. And later, when I find out that so and so is so and so's son or daughter, and they're the hidden heir or whatever, right? So, I feel that's the older I get, the more I start to read that way.
That's an interesting point you made, PL, because Sean's comment, AP's thoughts on our expectations as readers and having issues with instant gratification has really helped me make my way through Malazan. I am about almost done with RG, which is my favorite book, and that just being in the moment has helped me read that series when I wasn't able to before, because I was always trying to see ahead. I was always trying to look ahead when I should just be focused on the page and what's happening in the moment. So I thought that was an interesting comment there.
Well, one of the predominant forms of storytelling that I think we're seeing more and more of, because it is more accessible, it's easier for a broader audience, is a chronological sequence that's very well plotted. The narrative events are folded into each other very cleverly, and there's meticulous craftsmanship in where the thing is going. But everything is laid out up front for the reader. So if there's magic in the world, and it's in a system, the magic system is detailed and explained. And now, once you know all about the magic system, it's going to be a central aspect of everything that's going to happen. But so that's why it's explained first. This character is important. Let me spend 10 pages with this character, because a lot of what we have is we want to know this. I want to know. I want to be able to look it up on my phone and know who the character is. I want to be able to Google and go, oh, so that's what they look like. I want to know everything up front. And because we have that technology in all other aspects of our lives, that's one of the things that is dominating, I think, a lot of popular fiction, is get it to the reader up front. And then people go, oh, well, it was front loading everything. And again, you can't win. But then we want a sequence of events to carry us along. And you can do that a lot better in some respects with a chronological sequence of events, because cause and effect, it's a natural progression. It's the easy flow of time. And if you then have a flashback, well, that's a break in the narrative. You've broken up pacing. You've disrupted the narrative flow. And yet we accept flashbacks all the time. We accept flash forwards slightly more rarely, but they happen. There are different ways of approaching it. But because I think there's been this movement towards simplifying certain aspects of narrative and explaining things, and even if it's showing them, not telling them, if you don't want to get into that argument, but showing them up front and going, this is going to be important. Big arrows. I'm going to explain this. Now that you know, let's carry on. And we accept that in written narrative, but we've seen TV shows that have done that have gone, right, we're now going to explore this thing. And people go, well, why did they do that? I want to know what happens next. Why did they stop the narrative flow to do that? You go, it's a bottle episode. They've done this to explore this concept because it's going to come up in season 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. Let's just get it all out and done in one go. We have these different expectations. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And very much it's an individual preference. But chronological storytelling, a strong narrative sequence of events, front loading of information, when someone comes in giving very detailed physical, visual information about them and being very clear about their motivations, which 20 years ago we would have regarded as quite simplistic and quite reductive, but now it's considered, but that's what people want, so give them what they want. And I think that is a style that's come into fore across certain genres.
I'm so sorry, guys, but I gotta go to work. So this has been just delightful, wonderful, and I'm just gonna put out a request to do this again. But thank you for having me, Steve. It's so nice to meet you, AP and Epic and PL. I'll talk to you guys soon, I'm sure. But yeah, thank you so much for this, everyone.
Thank you
This
for
is
Have a
coming out.
fantastic
Take care,
great
Taylor.
way to
Have a good
start
shift.
the day.
Loved having
All
you.
right, thanks. All right, see you.
See you later. Bye-bye now.
Our friend Mike from Mike's Book Reviews, he's the reason I'm even on book 2, him and Slowly Read. Mike says, great collection of readers. Steve enjoyed it quite a bit. Hey, thanks for dropping by, Mike. And Eric says, we've been promised the next Game of Thrones for 20 years, and we're so
That is just mean. Eric, go and sit on the naughty step.
we were AP. We've had the ongoing discussion about things like do writers like the GRMs, the Patrick Rothfuss, do they owe us that next installment? Is it completely unfair that they're keeping us waiting so long? You talked about the instant gratification, a bit of that thing, and because of how the TV series ended for a lot of people inadequately, whether or not that spoiled the continuation of their actual writing for the author and things like that, but Game of Thrones is unfortunately one of those things now that it's somewhat of a microcosm of that gratification, because we want the story to finish the way we want it. That's what we wanted. That's what we wanted the TV show, and now that's what we wanted out of the books. But meanwhile, you're wondering what JRM is thinking. He's like, oh my gosh, I can never live up to the expectations of readers now, because I've put this show has come out that has gone ahead of my writing, and that people found the ending unsatisfactory, and then what now? But I'm interested to hear your take on that specifically.
Well, first of all, even if J.R.R. Martin used, George R.R. Martin used exactly the same thing that happened at the end. Remember at the beginning, we were talking about, depending on who writes it, that is going to change how you experience it. And even if basically the same thing happened, how that would be communicated to the reader would be in his style, would fulfill the thing that we love about those books. So I would have no problems with that. The one, when people say, do authors owe us the next book? And I don't know about you, but I have never met a single author who goes, I'm going to draw this out as long as possible. I want them on tenterhooks. Every single author I know wishes that they could get what was in their head onto the page as perfectly as possible. And if they could do it by waving a wand, they would wave that wand and have the thing appear, because it's in their head and they're trying to get it out. No author I have ever met goes, nah, I just can't be bothered. I'll get to it at some point. So I think that it's slightly, sometimes how we phrase the question is actually important. And I think in this case, looking at it in terms of, well, what are we entitled to? Well, did you pre-order it? No, then you're entitled to nothing. Go away. You're not part of that. Every author wants to finish their story. Every author wants to tell their story. And life happens. Life gets in the way. Medical conditions happen. Pandemics happen. Our mental health happens. But sure, let's have authors just do whatever they needs to be done in order to get that into my sweaty little mitts now, because they owe it to me. An author's conversation with their publisher, that's between the publisher and the author. There is a contract in place there. If anyone is going to talk about owing, it is going to be the publisher's conversation with the author. But in terms of reader, yes, we want it. And the author wants to give it to us. But for whatever variety of reason, it hasn't happened yet. And do you think asking George R.R. Martin or Patrick Rothfuss, have you done it yet, is going to have any more effect than that kid sitting in the back of the car while you're driving going, are we there yet? And you go, literally, if we were there, I would have stopped driving. if it was done, it would be published and you could buy it. Asking me, threatening me, sending abusive messages to me is not going to make me want to write any more or any faster. I already want to write.
Yeah.
So I have enormous sympathy for authors who come under incredible pressure and scrutiny by fans who go, I want it now. You go, congratulations, I want the pony. I want a pizza. I want this thing now. Why is that pizza taking 25 minutes? I want it here in 20. Now, is it difficult to wait? Yeah, it is. I've wanted the next book in the King Killer Chronicles. I've wanted the next book in A Song of Ice and Fire. I really wish that there'd be an announcement tomorrow. Oh, by the way, it's just been published. It'll be available next week. That would be amazing, and I'd be incredibly happy. But just because it hasn't happened, then it doesn't give me the right to send an abusive message or to say to any of them, well, you should be writing. You go, oh, well, that's, we've all had moments of tragedy in our lives. And someone has said to us, well, I needed you to do this thing. And you go, I'm really sorry. I honestly, I will get to it when I get to it. And I think we've lost this ability to empathize with the fact that that is a human being sitting there.
Yes.
And we see this in discussion of TV shows. So you don't like how so-and-so adapted the book that you love. That doesn't give you the right to be abusive. And they thought, again, writers, and you are creative, you write. If someone said, I want you to do this, you would do your best. Now, your best mightn't match the expectations of some of the audience.
Yes.
But you wouldn't deliberately sabotage something. You wouldn't deliberately go, oh, well, I'm just going to be mean about this because I didn't like this book. Then you wouldn't be involved in the project. Showrunners, writers, the writer's room, they are doing their best. And we can criticize it and say we didn't enjoy it. I think that could have been better. But none of that is to say anything about their motivation going, oh, they disrespected the text. And again, it's a lot about what we project onto something. And we're ascribing motivation. George R.R. Martin, he should have finished. Really? Harper Lee wrote To Kill a Mockingbird.
Mm-hmm.
How long did we have to wait for the next book?
Yes. It's so funny because so many people. The hardest reviews for me to digest are the ones where somebody says, "I totally accept. I didn't like the character. I didn't like your writing style. I didn't like first person. I didn't like too extensive world building. I didn't like your gratuitous battle scenes. I didn't like." The hardest ones to address are that, well, if I would have written the book, I would have written it this way. Those are the ones that I literally sit there and go, okay, and I have to accept that because, again, the book belongs to you. You paid your hard-earned money. I appreciate you doing it. I appreciate you taking the time and the time and effort to write a review because that means the world to me. And reviews are like gold because they can highlight exposures in your writing, potentially make you a better writer, and those are all great things, right? You can't be tone deaf to your readership. You also have to, write the book you want to write, but yet be cognizant of, people's criticisms, especially if they're consistent amongst the large. But those are the hardest reviews. Like, I wish you would have written the book like this. I wish you would have taken this, and that is what I feel so horrible about for someone like GRM is that, because of the show was depicted as such. Now GRM has to, he doesn't have to do anything, but he may or may not feel compelled to write something that, while essentially may have the same conclusion, but is going to be so much different, especially in terms of, we all know the one character arc that he's, people are wanting to see more fleshed out to make it seem more believable at the end, based on what the show said. And you're right, AP, that pressure must be just because it's so hard to address those things, right? Like,
But also, someone who says, I wish, if you'd written it this way, it would have been better. And you go, well, it would have been better for you and maybe some other people, but it wouldn't necessarily have been better for those people over there, because that's the thing about it that they loved. And this is actually, it's a really weird thing about editing. People sometimes, one of the criticisms I see online about a lot of stuff is it needed better editing. I honestly don't know what a lot of those people think editing is. But it's not what actually happens when you edit a novel, or even when you edit a film. But when I am editing, and obviously I do a lot of what I do and like to focus on is developmental editing. That's my preference. I don't try and get the author to write the book that I want, because I'm not the author. And if I wanted that book, I have to go off to my desk and write that book. But what I try to show is an understanding of what is on the page and how it might be interpreted and why that might be a problem, or why the thing on the page is absolutely brilliant. More of this, please. This is actually really excellent, the way that you do this. Oh, you subverted my expectations here. This is a slight plot hole because of X, Y, and Z. Oh, you introduced this thing here. Why didn't he do that earlier? Oh, earlier he did that thing. Why can't he do it here? And those sorts of conversations. But I never go, right, you've introduced this. You need to do this thing because that's how I would do it. Don't use that word. That's not a good word. I prefer this word. You go, but, and my brother hates that word. Like, which of us are going to be your reader? You don't know. You have to write your story. And when it comes to criticism of text, it's a difficult thing to learn. There's a difference between being critical of the text and being critical of how you felt when you read it. So focusing on your reading experience. And this is a debate that goes round and round and round and about various things. But if you focus on the text, then you're analyzing the text. And that comes with a whole toolkit of different approaches and words and terminology and the things that you want to talk about. But if you're talking about how you felt in you're calling it a review, that's not necessarily a review of the book. No, you're reviewing how you felt when you read your reading experience. You're telling people how you felt. I loved that character. Great. What does that tell me who doesn't know you? I loved the way that this book made me feel. I felt great reading it. Fantastic. I'm not you. How will I feel? Whereas if someone tells me those aspects about the book, oh, it's a military science fiction. It's space opera. There's a lot of action in it. These are all elements that the person listening to the review can take on board. But you should have done it this way. That would have made it better. Is one of those things that we do reflexively when we think about what it is that we like, and we universalize it. And this brings us back to that point. The norms that we have, our preferences, our cultural norms, what we assume about the world that is individual to us, we so often universalize because we think that's how everyone else thinks, feels, and should approach things. So when someone says, if you'd done this, it would have been better, they're universalizing their experience and thinking that all readers are going to feel that way about it, even if they're doing it unconsciously or not.
So like I completely I love how you articulate like the experience of a writer in comparison to how people digest the knowledge, the story itself. How do you feel in terms of like with adaptations, right? Would you still give that like olive branch to like people adapt like the story? Like for instance, right, how did you feel about the last season? You've read A Song of Ice and Fire. How did you feel about the what was done to Daenerys's character, like how it unfolded, the execution of it itself? Like as someone who like read, because that is also a creative process, and they are also going through that process of developing things and interpreting things and trying to like adapt it to cinema and all of that. But there are some things like when like the essence of a character, I feel sometimes, and I'm not saying it as a criticism, I understand it's subjective, but the essence of a character has been bleached away, a character that is beloved by like the original readers, like in the case of Wheel of Time, like that basically made the franchise, brought the franchise to a place where studios were like, okay, it would be lucrative to adapt this as a TV, but the souls of those characters are now bleached. Like, how would you
Okay.
like in terms of criticism, or like what is a fair way to assess that, and like the
Okay,
anger that is felt? Yeah.
Give me an example from Wheel of Time of a character that you think that they have radically changed.
Sorry, could you give me 1 second? Someone is knocking on my door.
Oh,
Just give me 1 second. Yeah, 1 second. I'm so sorry.
Well, we could talk generally about adaptation is an interesting thing because it's not any one thing. And I think like Epic raises a brilliant point here, because adaptation is fascinating and complex. But you take something like Heinlein's Starship Troopers. The politics of Heinlein's book Starship Troopers are not the politics of the film Starship Troopers.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you before. Sorry, what are you saying?
Oh, no problem. We were carrying on just to talk about adaptation in general.
Okay.
So if you can think of, pick one character from Wheel of Time that you think has just been changed, that isn't the same character anymore.
So, for instance, Eye of the World was a coming of age story. For instance, it was a coming of age story. There were kids and everything, but then in the adaptation, they were made a lot more mature, and there were aspects of the like I don't know if I should spoil like the series itself, but Rand and his love interest, you know, like that relationship, essentially, like I feel like it was a bit like that's just one example, and I'm saying this because I made a whole rant review about it.
Yeah, but okay, so let's talk about the aging up of actors. They are young adults because they're all in their very early 20s, and from my perspective, that's basically the same as 15 because they're young. Now, for someone who's in their early 20s, you might be going, oh, well, they all look the same. They're meant to look younger than me. And it was meant to be a coming of age narrative. But if you had put that on for a general audience as a coming of age narrative, and remember, the Eye of the World is told 90% from a male point of view, but none of the rest of the series is. The rest of the series is split in terms of point of view, roughly 50-50 according to gender. And the rest of the series isn't a coming of age narrative. That disappears out because they get to an age and it's now about them being mature adults and having relationships. So if the majority of the series is not a coming of age story, do you, when you adapt the whole of the Wheel of Time, say, right, well, we're going to sell season 1 as a boys coming of age story and get people invested in that, and then when they get to season 2 and it's not a boys coming of age story, it's a radically different story that is going to quintuple the female presence, we're going to reduce the male presence, it's not going to be coming of age anymore, it's going to be a different thing. Are we going to have the same audience retention? Because we created an expectation about what this series is, and we haven't lived up to it. Now, that's one aspect. The second aspect is, okay, so we'll cast a whole load of children who are going to be 15, and we're going to be filming this for the next 8 years, which means they are going to radically change between season 1 being filmed and season 2, because that's what happens when you're 15. You grow a lot. So the actors physically are going to change. When you employ children, you have different labor laws than when you employ adults, and that's going to limit the amount of time that you can film. So that's why, if you remember back to a lot of those high school TV shows that used to be on TV all the time, famously Beverly Hills 90210 back in the day, when everyone was basically 30 and in high school. That's where the Steve Buscemi meme comes from. The idea of these much older people playing younger people. Look at Dawson's Creek, all of these YA shows where much older actors are playing younger characters because it's expedient, it is practical, and you can work them harder and longer without the law shutting you down. And then you look at the relationships in that episode. Yeah, so they have a romantic relationship. It's not as will they, won't they, but it is a point of contention across the series, and it is about his old flame. And as we were talking earlier on about a lot of fantasy novels, particularly the 90s and earlier, where people didn't really exist below the waist. They didn't do that. But for a modern audience, you're telling me that teenagers, even 15, 16, whatever age, in these high schools, it's going to be easier for them to relate to these people that they're chaste and will hold hands and look at each other? Or do you want something that is slightly more reflective of our reality and our lived experience, that maybe they were messing and fooling around, but we want to deal with this sensitively? So we're not going to deal with it with teenagers. We'll age them up a little bit, and people will readily identify with that and go, yeah, that's okay. So it's a slight change from the superficial reality of the book. But in terms of the intentionality and the relationship, it's actually very, very similar. It's still about their relationship and love for each other and being promised to one another. But then that is broken. So that isn't actually a massive change.
I guess. Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Well, thank you for that. I can't argue with that. Like, they're adapting it to a modern audience and everything. But yeah, I just wouldn't watch the rest of the seasons. I'll just stick to the books.
and that's fine.
That's fine. Yeah.
But one of the things about this is you don't have to like the changes. You don't have to like how they've adapted it. But it doesn't mean that the adaptation itself is bad. It just means that it's not your cup of tea. You wanted something that was closer to the books, that it was more a replication of the book instead of an adaptation of the book. Because if you think, like, The Handmaid's Tale is going into season 5 now?
Yes.
And you go, when did they start diverging from the book? Would that be episode 1? Yes. But you don't have people up in arms going, they are disrespecting Margaret Atwood's brilliant text. With The Handmaid's Tale, you go, no, it's a brilliant adaptation. That is now, it has a life of its own and it's amazing, but it is definitively Atwood's story and Atwood's world and what she was exploring. When we look at Lucifer with Tom Ellis, and that was a wildly popular show, but I don't remember that being picketed with people saying, how dare you disrespect the comics? This isn't what the comic did. That they had it was an episode by episode, so episodic serial style, and then there was a meta arc that tangentially occasionally bumped into one of the storylines from the comics. But in terms of physical representation, he has the wrong hair color, the wrong accent, it's in the wrong city. It's not a piano bar, it's a nightclub with a piano in it, which it's kind of similar. They changed all the characters, they gender swapped a bunch of people, they race swapped a bunch of people. But we all enjoyed it, but they turned it into a cop show. If anyone's read a Lucifer comic, it's not a cop show. Yeah. So that is adaptation. And so why is it when it comes to certain properties, they're disrespecting the source material because they deviated, they made a change? The Boys on Amazon's just relaunched season 3. And like almost everyone I talk to loves The Boys as a brilliant deconstruction of superheroes, and it's over the top and it's violent and it's incredibly well written. If you've read the comic books, well, it has a passing similarity to the comic books. But again, we don't complain about that, going, how dare they? They're disrespecting the text, or they didn't stick closely enough to it. Oh, sorry, I go on rants. I do apologize.
No, I totally understand, and thank you so much for that explanation. Like, I would definitely give it more thoughts when I'm making rant reviews for sure. But so I cannot wait to read A Drowned Kingdom, and I'm going to definitely.
I'm honored. Thank you.
Binge like your channel, like AP, like 100%, because there's so much I feel like I can learn from the way you articulate yourself when it comes to writing, narrative, dialogue. Before this started, I was watching one on dialogue as well, and I was really enjoying that. but I have to go like right now. So
Yeah.
thank you so much. I really enjoyed this experience. I'm better for it. Have a wonderful day. Stay
Take
epic.
care, Epic. Yeah.
Pleasure
Yeah.
meeting you. Bye bye. Take care.
Pleasure meeting you as well. Bye.
APM, thanks for staying up late with us. No
But,
sleep.
but one last thing, I will absolutely support and defend 100% Epic's right to not like the Wheel of Time adaptation, to not enjoy it, to think that these were the wrong changes to make, because he's right. From his point of view, that wasn't what he wanted, and it is absolutely 100% fine to have that opinion. But
I think there's an innate. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I know we have to go because we're running quite a bit of time. We could talk forever, I'm sure, but I think there's an innate desire in many of us for something to be canon, for material that is canon to stick as close, especially if it's written in a book, and a very popular book. That when it's adapted to the bigger small screen, that it has to be essentially as close as possible within reason to match, which we know is impossible. It is impossible for budgetary reasons. It's possible for time reasons. It's impossible for so many reasons that. But I think, just quickly back to the Game of Thrones model, that people felt that because the writers were going off the source material so much more closely in the first few seasons, and because you had those first few books, and then of course once GRM had the shows when I had the books and they were relying on simply notes for GRM, but not the actual books having been written, that became such an issue. But if you think about it, that was unavoidable because the books weren't written, right? So but anyways, that's just the point I want to make.
But that's a fascinating point about the idea of canon and the idea of lore. We see this a lot in Star Wars. We see it a lot in comic books. But let's think about all of the superhero movies that we've seen. How many different Batman films have there been? And how many times have they changed Batman canon, Batman lore? That, who killed Bruce Wayne's parents? Well, it was Jack Napier who became the Joker, or it was Joe Chill, or it was... And they change things because it's an adaptation. It's not the source material. But we have an expectation. We want it to be recognizable or in some way related to the thing that we love. But when it comes to, say, Star Wars, the Obi-Wan Kenobi TV show was just launched. And some people are going, but this has changed from the Clone Wars, the cartoon. And you're like, well, when did the Clone Wars establish canon for the Star Wars universe? Oh, well, then they changed those books. Those books are no longer canon, but these books are. And you go, George Lucas changed the canon of Star Wars between Star Wars A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. I'll remind you, Luke and Leia did not start out as brother and sister.
Exactly.
Vader did not start out as Darth being a title. That was his first name.
Yeah.
That even the idea of Darth Vader being Luke's father wasn't the original genesis of the idea. Now, we talk about retrospective continuity, retconning things, creating the idea of cohesion. And it suits that pattern need that we have in our brains, that it's all neat, it all fits. But does it really matter that Luke and Leia went from being brother or being sort of prince and princess love interest to brother and sister by the end of it, even though it was clearly never intended from the beginning?
Yes. Yeah.
But it went that way because Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher had much better chemistry than Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher did on screen. But whatever, or maybe they felt it would just make it more interesting. But those things happened, those changes were made, and we don't get bent out of shape about it. We just, go, okay, so it's slightly internally inconsistent. Is it radically inconsistent? No. So why does it need to be absolutely faithful? Why does everything need to be nailed down? And I think, weirdly enough, this is a legacy of Tolkien.
Yes.
Tolkien created such a meticulous history and world that there are inconsistencies in it. There were things he changed his mind on and tweaked them over time. But that became a blueprint almost for how we're meant to think about it, how we're meant to interact with it, how we're meant to consider it. Like the idea of the Rings of Power TV show conflating thousands of years into a much smaller time period. But everyone is aghast. You go, but what's the big deal? And we do that all the time. Like, you read the Iliad, and you go, oh, I read how long did the Battle of Troy take? Oh, well, it took about a weekend, according to the Iliad. And then, who founded Rome? Oh, well, it was Aeneas, according to the Aeneid, or Romulus and Remus. Well, that's inconsistent. Has anyone considered the lore? What's the canonical answer? And you go, history is inconsistent. Life is inconsistent. And we accept these things in story because the story is the thing that we're meant to be interested in, rather than this meticulous encyclopedic knowledge of a world.
Yeah, you're so right, and it's almost like saying, you look at the Lord of the Rings movies, which I love, and I'm a huge Tolkien fan. But one of my favorite characters, in terms of a relatively minor character, doesn't appear until the Return of the King, in Hall of Dol Amroth. Well, he's totally written out of for obvious reasons from the Return of the King movies. But is that going to spoil my enjoyment of? Am I going to let that spoil my enjoyment of Return of the King, because he is integral in some ways to the plot of the third book? However,
I like to think that he and Glorfindel are sitting out in the back of one of the trailers from the movie set going, no, we're on strike. And they're sitting there and they're having a great time. Anytime there's an adaptation of the Fellowship of the Ring, be it Rankin Bass, actually, I can't remember the Rankin Bass one, but in Bakshi or Jackson, Glorfindel erasure, I will not stand for it. These things, Tom Bombadil being erased. The 17 years at the start of the Fellowship of the Ring in the Shire gets conflated to what, like a summer?
Yeah, summer, basically.
We conflate time in stories all the time in adaptation. We change things around. The journey through the forest, Old Man Willow, Tom Bombadil, the Barrow Downs, where the hobbits get their swords. And then you have the extended edition scene where Aragorn just happened to be walking around just so he could arm the hobbits in a marsh. You're like, and you know why that scene was excised, because you looked at it and went, that makes no sense. That's dumb. Why would he have it? All of the scenes in Bree, a lot of that was condensed. Like, so much of it changed. And because fans loved and enjoyed the film, they don't go, oh, but this was inaccurate. They changed huge chunks of it. Yes. And yet we love the film. But it is not as accurate as people think. Mm-hmm. And one of the big things is translating a novel to a film. You're going from a self-contained narrative unit, a novel, into a self-contained narrative unit, a film. It's the same as going from one story and putting it as a TV episode. It's a one-to-one, because there's a beginning, middle, and end, if you want to be that sort of simple and straightforward. Going from one novel to a TV show made of multiple episodes, you go, ooh, different structure. So it's going to start at the start and end at the end, but this is made up of X number of chapters. That doesn't match the number of episodes. It's not divisible by the number of episodes. We need a mid-season finale, and there isn't that in the book. We need a bottle episode because the actors needed time off to do this thing. We need to cover this. That's going to require a second unit to film all of that stuff. Why don't we move that thing to here? We'll get rid of that thing. We'll do. And suddenly, when you're going from one type of narrative, a novel, into TV show, multiple episodes, that's a very significant structural change. And there are different ways to do it. But it isn't the same as book to film. And that, I think people overlook that one as well as a very simple, straightforward one, that it's not necessarily as neat.
Yeah, very true. AP, thanks for staying up. I know it's late for you. Thanks for staying up.
Oh my God, sorry, AP, to keep you up.
Anytime you want to come by, just let us know. You're welcome anytime to come in. And we'd love to hear your rants.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much. And I am so I feel like I've been talking over people and talking far too much and not letting anyone else talk. And I feel really, really bad about that. But I wanted to thank you for the invitation. I wanted to thank you for the brilliant conversation. I have had so much fun, and it has been absolutely wonderful. So thank you very much for organizing this and putting up with me.
Yeah, no, of course. You're a guest, so we wanted to pick your brain. That was the whole point. So, but anytime you'd like to come by, you're always welcome.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for coming by to chat with us, and hope everyone has a great weekend.